Allow me, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, to deviate a little bit from the usual protocol for occasions like this and start on a personal note. I know that one shouldn't do this, but I'll do it anyway. For me, as director of this wonderful institution, this very day represents the moment when my tenure here as director of the Diplomatic Academy comes to a full circle. On October 8, 2009, my first academic year as director of the DA was inaugurated, yes, you guessed it, by no other than then Federal President Dr. Heinz Fischer. And today, almost 7 years later, the inaugural speech on the occasion of the beginning of the academic year 2016-2017 is delivered again by Dr. Heinz Fischer now, and allow me to say very personally, unfortunately, now former Federal President. So as this is my last inauguration ceremony, my function as director started in the way ends with a speech by President Fischer. And I would like to thank the President for having agreed to be here today and give him all a very hearty welcome. It's an honor and a pleasure to welcome you, Mr. President. Let me right at the outset also greet all our partners. The DA, of course, could not function without the many institutions which help us in various ways to carry out our tasks. Above all, of course, the Federal Ministry for Europe, Integration and Foreign Affairs, and I welcome Hanna Liko, a graduate of the DA, as the representative of the Secretary General and Chairman of the Board of Trustees. I welcome all the other ministries with whom we have very close and fruitful cooperation, the universities, in particular the University of Vienna and the Technical University, with whom we have cooperation programs, the other members of the Board of Trustees, the various academic institutions and think tanks. I welcome all the representatives of the embassies and international organizations. I can tell you that we are very proud to be a well-established part of the diplomatic community in Vienna, and it gives me great pleasure to see so many ambassadors here today, many of whom are very good friends of the Academy, and I hope you will have some time after the ceremony to spend some time with us and with those students that are here today who come from your respective countries. I welcome all the other representatives and all the sponsors of the media and those who help us to be ever better, like the city of Vienna, which I want to thank in particular, and all the others who have proven to be good friends of the DA over the years. I would also like to welcome one of my predecessors, Ambassador Leifler. Welcome. And of Mrs. Sucharepa, because she, of course, represents through her late husband part of the history of this institution. But now I finally come to you, dear students, because after all, this is your day. I greet those who start their program at the DA and on the old hands who already know everything. I wish you, in the name of all of us, great success. And also don't forget to have a good time at the DA and in our beautiful city of Vienna. President Fischer was kind enough to send me his new book, Eine Wortmeldung. I appreciate that, Mr. President. I have read the book with great attention. And I want to assure you, at this occasion, the values you and the qualities you speak about in your book are also very much the ones the DA puts in the center of its approach to education and training. We are an open institution where tolerance, openness, and caring for others is very high on the agenda. I would also like to give a special welcome to the 7th special course for students from Israel and Palestine who have just started their 3-week course. We are very happy to have you, and we wish you a good time in Vienna. They're over there. I don't want to be too long and cut into the time of the president, although I've told him he can speak as long as he likes. I'm sure you wouldn't mind. But I would like to tell you a few facts about this year's academic year at the DA. We have a record number of 187 students, which is the highest number in the history of the Diplomatic Academy since 1964. 40% of our students come from Austria, the other 60% from around 44 countries from 4 continents. As was the case in the last 10 years, the United States is leading, followed by UK, Italy, Germany, Russian Federation, and then, of course, many other countries. It is very interesting that over the years, even over the 8 years that I have been director, the academic background of students has changed. They are every year more with a political science background and less with an economics, and even less with a law background. It was quite different, Paul, when you were here, and even less so when I was here 50 years ago, because I'm a graduate of this institution myself, and I'm very proud of it. I also would like to give a special welcome to our exchange students, 2 from Stanford University, Guanucci and Katik Sibaram, 1 from MGIMO in Moscow, Daniel Karitonov, and more exchange students will follow in January, 1 from Korean University, and in the fall of next year, for the first time, and I'm very happy about this, from the Chinese Foreign Affairs University in Beijing. In our cooperative degree program, I welcome 1 student from Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of Tufts University in Boston, and 3 students from Johns Hopkins in Bologna at the DA. 1 DA student is now at Johns Hopkins SAIS Europe. Now, these exchange programs are very important to us. It's a limited program, but at the same time, I think it's an enrichment for the Academy, and we certainly want to continue this. I welcome all the professors and the members of the faculty. There are 10 resident professors and roughly 70 professorial lectures from our partner universities, from Austria and from many countries abroad, Europe and overseas. I would also like to give a special welcome to DASI. Now, for those of you who don't know, DASI stands for Diplomatic Academy Student Initiative. They are a very active student union representation, and they organize a whole range of activities, and I personally believe that this is very much part of education, and we look forward to the annual ball, to a conference, to ETIA talks, to the new Polemics, which is a newspaper that the students publish themselves, members of the Wine Society who have won already 2 competitions. Congratulations. So you see, there are a whole range of activities that are carried out by the students themselves. And finally, I would like to mention that since the opening of the Academy in 1964, founded by then Foreign Minister Bruno Kreisky, we have 2,129 graduates. Almost 60% of them are members of the Alumni Club. I welcome, I haven't seen him, but I think he's here, the president of the club, Oliver Kitz, and Ernst Rosi, the chairman of the Association for the Advancement of Teaching at the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. I could, of course, now go on, tell you for the next 2 hours about the Academy and what we are doing. I can only say, if I look around, students, we are proud of you. We know that you will be successful, you will finish your studies with excellence, and let me, all of you, wish a very, very successful academic year. Thank you very much.
Hochgeschätzter Herr Direktor der Diplomatischen Akademie Wien, Staatssekretär Dr. Winkler, Excellencies, dear students, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be with you at this moment when you celebrate the inauguration of the coming academic year at Vienna's Diplomatic Academy, which has a long history and, as I believe, a good international reputation. I was invited to be present and to address you, and I accepted with great pleasure, not only because teaching at the University of Innsbruck will be one of the things I intend to do in the next year, or in the next years, I don't know, but also because I'm often reflecting over the question how policy is made, whether people learn from history, or whether it is true that they don't learn from history. There was a famous Austrian writer, Ingeborg Bachmann, and she said and wrote, "History is teaching, but it finds no pupils, no listeners." And I oppose this pessimistic opinion. I often say the very existence of this country, Austria, as it is now, or as it has developed in the last 70 years, since end of World War II, can only be understood and can only be explained if you know the history before the foundation of this country. And in these days, I mean not the days in particular, but in this time, it is logical that we look back on history, because 2 years ago it was exactly 100 years since World War I started and changed Europe and the world profoundly. Last year it was 70 years since this Second Republic of Austria was re-established and refounded. And in 2 years' time, 2018, this country, similar to Czech Republic or similar to Hungary and other countries, will celebrate its 100th birthday. The Republic of Austria, after the monarchy, was founded on November the 12th, 1918. At the beginning of the 20th century, there were 5 big powers in Europe: Germany, France, Great Britain, Russia, and Austria, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy. Then came World War I, and I don't have time to say even 2 sentences to this war, but the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, with around 50 million inhabitants and more than 500,000 square kilometers, collapsed, and a lot of new states emerged. Czech Republic, as I said already, or Czechoslovakia, as it was originally. Hungary became independent. Parts of Austria went to Italy, parts of Austria to Poland, parts of Austria to Romania, etc., etc. This was a state where a very famous book has the title Der Staat, den keiner wollte. The state nobody wanted. Not the other countries and not Austria herself. There were great doubts. And I remind you that Austria was not founded as Austria, but as German Austria, Deutsch Österreich. The monarchy was changed to republic, and the name of the republic was Republik Deutsch Österreich. And there was a strong mood for a unification of Austria and Germany, namely the two big German-speaking countries, or relative big German-speaking countries. The Allied powers, those who won the war, did not allow this. In the peace treaty from Saint-Germain, it was forbidden a reunification. And I fully agree with this approach that Austria should be an independent country. But in these days, there were not only people in Austria in favor of such a unification because they were afraid that Austria alone would not be able to exist. It would be too weak, it would have no future, it would be a state nobody wants. But also the ideology of a unification of Austria and Germany was a very important movement at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. On the other hand, the republic was not unchallenged. The emperor, the last emperor, Karl, he subscribed a manifesto where he hoped to have a chance that the monarchy could survive if he says, I give away all powers of governing. Ich verzichte auf alle Anteile an den Regierungsgeschäften. But he did not say, I resign or I step down. So there was always a very tense situation between monarchists and Republicans. The Republicans were afraid that the monarchy could be reinstituted, and the monarchs were angry that the monarchy was destroyed by a more or less revolutionary act. It was a revolutionary act according to the law, but happily there were only quotation marks, a few casualties, and not a civil war in these days that could be avoided. Therefore, the political climate in Austria of the First Republic was a very tense one. And it became more and more tense because of the economic crisis and the social crisis and the rising amount of unemployment. And an additional factor was that democracy in these days, in the 20s, in the 30s of the last century, was not a really successful political model in Central Europe. The idea of a strong leader, of a Führer, of a strong fist, of a strong arm, was gaining more and more support. In Hungary, Horthy, Admiral Horthy, became the strong man. In Italy, Mussolini soon came to power. In Germany, it lasted longer. Only in January 1933, Hitler came to power. In Poland, it was Pilsudski. And in Austria, this tendency also was growing. the position of the president of the country in the Constitution of 1920, from 1st October 1920, was made extremely weak because there was the fear that from the position of president there could develop something like in France, from republic back to monarchy with Napoleon III or Napoleon I already. And so they wanted to keep the president very, very weak. And then the desire to a stronger president was growing. And there was a big change of our constitution in 29, and only since 29, the president had a very strong position to appoint the government, to dismiss the government, to dissolve parliament, to be the supreme commander in the army, and other things. But the constitution, and to be elected by the people, and not by both houses of parliament. This change of the constitution took place in 29, but already very soon later, not only the constitution was changed, but it was broken, and it was not anymore valid. First, in March 33, Parliament was dissolved. It's a complicated process, but let me put it in this one sentence. In 34, a civil war started in February 34, and on 1st May 34, a new constitution was enforced, not a democratic one, and Austria was an authoritarian country, and the philosophy of a strong man on top of the country was also the ruling philosophy. Germany, on its side, also was interested on a unification between Austria and Germany. As I said, it was forbidden, but Hitler made more and more pressure in that direction. And in Austria, there were three main forces. The Social Democrats, at the last elections, at the last three elections in 31, they were the strongest party. Then the Christian Democrats, the second strong party, and the Großdeutschen, those who were in favor of merging between Austria and Germany, number three. And out of this group of Großdeutschen, more and more changed and went over to the nationalsozialistische Bewegung, to the Nazi movement. So the illegal Nazi movement became stronger and stronger. And Hitler used every possible instrument to put pressure on Austria and to strengthen the Nazi movement in Austria. In February 38, on the 12th February 38, Hitler invited the Austrian Prime Minister, Schuschnigg in these days, to come to Hitler in Bavaria on Obersalzberg, and he said, look, if you don't give the way free to the Nazi movement, if you don't take representatives of the Nazi movement in your government, if you don't free many prisoners from the Nazi movement, etc., 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 we will use other instruments to enforce our goals and our ideas. Schuschnigg in February 34 was in an almost hopeless situation. And in the very, very last moment, he tried to make contacts to the illegal opposition, to the Social Democrats, to trade unions, to illegal trade union leaders, whether a united front could be built to defend against Germany. And his idea was to have a referendum on March 13th, 38, to ask the people, do you want to remain as an independent Austrian state, or do you want to go the other direction? When Hitler saw that such a referendum was planned, he was, I would say, panicking. He was afraid the referendum would reject the idea of unification. And this was his way to make policy. He said, today is February the 11th. Certainly, today is March the 11th. I send a message to the Austrian Prime Minister. If you don't resign today and appoint a member of the Nazi Party as Austrian Prime Minister, I will invade the country. There were only a few hours to react, and the Prime Minister, Schuschnigg, made a speech in radio at 5 o'clock in the afternoon saying, Ich weiche der Gewalt, I give in to this pressure, I resign, God bless Austria. And in these hours already, on the 11th February, many Austrians who had their sympathies for the Nazi movement were waving the Nazi flags, were showing that they had the illegal symbol of the Nazi movement on the inside of their jackets and put it on the visible side of their jackets. And there was a great happiness and great acclamation. And in the early morning of the 12th March, Hitler's army invaded Austria from west, from Salzburg and from Tyrol. And from that day, the so-called Anschluss was realized, was a reality. And I explained this because I can tell you, when Austria was refounded after this terrible 7 years between 38 and 45, when Austria did not exist, when Austria was the so-called Ostmark, the eastern region of Germany, people have learned a lot of history. And those who were the enemies, the bloody enemies in the civil war of 35, of 34, were now ready in 45 to build a common government. Karl Renner, who was the last president of the parliament, and who was already prime minister in the years between 1918 and 1920, and who was forced to sign the Saint-Germain Treaty, was a sort of provisorial prime minister in April 45, before the World War was ended. It was by chance that he lived in a little city, a little town not far from Vienna, 60 kilometers from Vienna, Glocknitz. There he lived and wrote books and wrote poems and wrote letters, etc. He was retired. He was born in 1870, so he was in 1945 already 75 years old. But he had enough self-confidence, and he was saying, I will try to make a contribution to the refounding of Austria. And he went to a commandantura of the Russian army in Lower Austria, and he said, Mr. Major or Mr. Colonel, I'm Karl Renner from Austria, and I want you to tell your leader in Moscow that I'm still alive, and I would be ready to take responsibility to rebuild our country. This message went to Moscow, and we can see in the archives that Stalin was very interested. And it is reported that he said, "What? This old fox is still alive?" Because he knew Renner personally from the time before World War I. You know that Stalin has lived in Vienna almost a year when he lived in a flat in Schönbrunner Straße in the 12th district, where he wrote a book on the Nationalitätenfrage, questions of nations. And the problem of nations was a big problem for Russia. But the problem of nations and nationalities was also a big problem for Austria. And so, for instance, Otto Bauer, one of the leaders of the social democratic movement, he had written a very famous book on the Nationalitätenfrage. Stalin knew this book. Stalin came to Vienna to study the Nationalitätenfrage, and then he wrote a book. And Stalin gave order to the commanding general in Austria to support Renner, to take him in a sort security custody, to bring him to a villa in Vienna, and to give him assistance in trying to build the government. So Renner came to Vienna, got a villa. It is the same villa where at the moment the Iranian ambassador lives, in Ecke Leinzerstraße, Wenzgasse, in Hitzing. Then he moved to Döbling, and he made contacts to the Christian Democrats and to the communists. Because the Communist Party in Austria was always very small. Before World War II, the communists had never more than 2% in the parliamentary elections. The leaders of the Communist Party, like Koplenik and Ernst Fischer and others, went to emigration in Moscow, and now the Soviets brought them with an army plane to Vienna. And the Communist Party was, in these days, very constructive, because they believed, we also know this from documents and from letters, if there would be elections in Austria, we would get at least 30%, maybe 1/3 of the electorate. So in Hungary, in Poland, in Bulgaria, in Czechoslovakia, you know what happened. In Austria, this happened not. The Russians were not occupying the whole country, only the eastern part. And the American, the French, the British were in the rest of the country. Vienna, as the capital, was the 21 districts Vienna had in this time were divided 5 districts Russian, 5 American, 5 British, 5 French, and the first district was under United Allied Commando, and each month another nation took the command. In January the Russians, in February the Americans, in March the French, in April the British, in May the Americans. And you could, if you were a citizen of Vienna, there was the chiefs of the military police. And whoever was in the driver's seat, this country was in command in the first district in Vienna. If there was a Russian driver, it was the Russian month. If it was a French driver, it was the French month, etc. So Renner was ready to build an all-party government, a provisorial government. And that he did. He was leader. He had 3 deputies, 1 social democrat, Scherf, the later president, 1 conservative, Fiegel, the later prime minister, and 1 communist, Koplenik, who was later a prominent member in parliament. The communists said to the Russian army, if we make elections in Austria, we will be strong. We will have 30%. The Social Democrats will also be strong. The Christian Democrats will only be number 3. And if we make a coalition, we have reached our goals. in the western part of Austria, there was a lot of suspicion. But in the western part of Austria, there was a better judgment on the strengths of the communists. And so they also agreed to elections after a conference in September where all 9 districts or Bundesländer were represented. The result of the election was that the Christian Democratic Party got 81% seats, the 85 seats, the communists only 4, if I'm right, and Social Democrats 79, if this makes 165 all together. But anyway, the communists had only 4%. This was a great disappointment, but it was a new start and a new possibility. And the government and the coalition was working excellent. I believe that you would hardly find another European country where coalition governments between the 2 big parties was working or is working so good at this as it was the case in Austria after 1945. The communists left the government very soon. They had only 1 member in government, Mr. Altmann, the Minister for Energy, while in the provisorial government, 1 to 1 to 1, 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, the communists asked the Ministry of Education for Ernst Fischer, the Ministry of Interior and the Police for Mr. Honner, and the Ministry for Energy, and other ministries where they had lots of influence. But being in the government and having responsibility for the policy of the government and having only 1 minister and only 4 seats in parliament, this was not attractive for them. So the 2-party government was initiated, and they, as a consequence of the First Republic, and as an expression of learning from history, they said, we won't have trade union movements affiliated to the different parties, as it was in the First Republic. We want one united, non-partisan trade union federation. We want a chamber of commerce where the Social Democrats are also included and represented. We want not to have a coalition only in the federal level, we make it also in the Vienna city government. We want to cooperate in many, many fields. We agree in the basis and the basic elements of our economic policy, etc. This was a very fruitful period in our country, the period of reconstruction. The big goal was the State Treaty. And there were altogether, I believe, around 100 foreign minister conferences of the Allied powers where Vienna, Austria State Treaty was always on the agenda, but they never reached an agreement. Like in Germany, but in Germany, the division of the country in the eastern and in the western part and the affiliation to NATO was not finished in these years, but it was already on the way. And then Stalin passed away in 1953. And there was a power struggle, as you know, between Beria and Khrushchev. Beria was executed. Khrushchev became Secretary General. And he wanted to demonstrate that he's not strictly continuing the Stalinist policy. He wanted to give a signal, as he also did it on the 20th Party Congress from the Communist Party in February 1954. He wanted to give a signal of a new approach in some international questions. One of the examples was Austria. And the idea was, if Austria would accept neutrality, similar to Switzerland, then they could imagine a state treaty and the withdrawal of all foreign army soldiers. And the idea of neutrality in this situation and under these conditions was attractive. There was a discussion, but it was attractive. So an Austrian delegation, a high-ranking delegation with Prime Minister Raab, Deputy Prime Minister Scherf, Foreign Minister Fiegel, and Secretary of State in the Foreign Office Bruno Kreisky, went to Moscow, were accepted with great honors and with a strong representation of the Politburo on the airport, so that it is reported that Kreisky said to the Prime Minister, well, if they receive us with so much music and protocol, they cannot send us home afterwards sang- und klanglos. This is a German version for without respect and without singing and without any honorable approach. And it was true. And the state treaty already in May, on May 15th, was signed in Belvedere. And a new chapter in Austrian policy started. Soon after, on 26th of October 1955, the constitutional law on neutrality was accepted by the parliament, and a few weeks later, Austria joined the United Nations. A big backlash was the Hungarian Revolution, because Austria opened the borders to Hungary in summer and autumn of '56, accepted a lot, more than 150,000 refugees. But it must be said, the biggest part of them did not stay in Austria. They continued to Switzerland, to United States, to Canada, to Australia, etc. And the Austrian army, which was just founded after the state treaty, was ready to defend the borders. That was at least their task. If Russian soldiers should cross the borders to Austria in following and trying to catch refugees. And one day, a Russian soldier who crossed the border was shot by the Austrian army. This was a big shock for the Austrian government. They were very much afraid what would be the reaction of Russia, but there was no reaction. And so I can say Austria did a good job in 1956 in this difficult situation. And a similar job in 1968, when Prague Spring was smashed by the soldiers of the Warsaw Treaty. In the meantime, in 1966, I don't forget to look at my watch, the coalition was finished in 1966 because the Conservative Party got an overwhelming majority, and there were negotiations to build a coalition government even in this situation, but the approach of the Social Democratic Party and of the Conservative Party was not suitable for a compromise. Kreisky was one of the few who was furiously fighting for continuing the coalition. I was in these days already a young member of the Parteivorstand, of the executive committee of the party. And I remember when Kreisky stood up and was arguing, we learned successfully from history in the last 11 years, and if we go into opposition, who knows whether or not the situation and the confrontation like in the days and years before 38 may be the consequences. And the majority said, our country is ripe enough, is ready for a government and opposition situation. And I mention this because it is interesting that Kreisky, who was furiously against going into opposition, was a few months later elected as party chairman of the Social Democratic Party and was a very successful opposition leader and won the next elections in 1970 and became prime minister. And I'm quite sure if he would be successful in 1966 in saying we continue the coalition, he would not have been prime minister in 1970 until 83. These years from 1970 to 83 are a special period in our country. 15 years or so ago, have written a book under the title The Kreisky Years in Austria. It was really a chapter in our post-war history. And in 83, Kreisky lost the overall majority. He fell from 51% to 87% for the Social Democrats. And this was a big defeat. While today, the Social Democrats with 25% would be happy if they wouldn't have 48.7, but at least, let's say, 30%. They were already very happy. But the first decades after the war, Austria was de facto a two-party state. Social Democrats and conservatives together had never less than 90 or even sometimes 94, 95%, because when the Freedom Party came into parliament, there was for a certain time a four-party parliament, but then after the Hungarian revolutions, the communists were voted out of parliament, and then we had the three-party parliament until the Greens came into the parliament in the 18th. The biggest event in the 80s was the fall of the Iron Curtain, and on the same day in July 89, when Alois Mock, the Austrian foreign minister, and Gyula Horn, the Hungarian foreign minister, cut the Iron Curtain between Austria and Hungary symbolically, the parliament agreed on a resolution. The Austrian government was asked to send the application for membership in the European Union to Brussels. This was done. The negotiations took several years, but they were finished in 1994. And there was a referendum, 2/3 in favor of membership in the European Union, 1/3 against, and Austria became member in the European Union on 1st January 95. And with this day, 95, I would say the present period of policy has started in Austria, the last 20 years, but I will finish here. I wanted to explain how the development between World War I and World War II has positive influenced our development after World War II, and I tried to describe you the 60 years or the 50 years between 1945 and 1995. And if you have next inauguration ceremony, you can invite me to speak on the last 20 years in our history. Thank you very much.